There's a version of Steve Jobs you already know. The turtleneck, the stage, the one more thing. The genius who built Apple from a garage into the most valuable company on Earth. But that version is incomplete. Because behind the product launches and the standing ovations, there was something else happening. Something that the people closest to him could feel in the room before he even walked in. Something in his eyes that never quite rested, never quite settled. His colleagues called it intensity. His enemies called it cruelty. His biographers called it vision. But what if it was none of those things? What if Steve Jobs was not driven by ambition at all, but by something far older, far darker, and far more difficult to name? This is not the story of Apple. This is the story of what was happening inside the man who built it. Steve Jobs was abandoned before he could speak, not metaphorically, literally. His biological parents, a graduate student and a Syrian immigrant, gave him up at birth. He was adopted by Paul and Clara Jobs, a working-class couple in California who wanted a child more than anything in the world. On the surface, it was a happy story. But here's what no one talks about. Steve knew. From a very young age, he knew he had been given away. And somehow, instead of feeling broken by that knowledge, he transformed it. He told himself he wasn't abandoned. He told himself he was chosen, not by fate, not by God. He told himself he was chosen because he was special, different, set apart from ordinary people. Now, think about what that means for a child. To survive the psychological wound of abandonment, he built an entire identity on top of it. An identity that said, I matter. I matter so much that the universe itself has a plan for me. That's not confidence. That's something else. That's a story a frightened child tells himself in the dark. And the terrifying thing, he never stopped telling it. The people who worked with Steve Jobs described something they could never quite explain. They called it a reality distortion field. The term sounds playful, like a superpower. But listen to the way they described it when they weren't trying to be polite. He could make you believe something was possible, even when every fact, every engineer, every deadline said it wasn't. He didn't just persuade people, he replaced their reality with his own. A project would be deemed impossible by an entire team of experts. Steve would enter the room, look at them, and simply refuse to accept it, not with data, not with logic, with certainty. And somehow, people changed their minds. They'd walk out of meetings believing they could do the impossible, and then they'd go and actually do it. Now, ask yourself a question. What kind of mind produces that effect on other people? It's not charisma. Charismatic people make you feel good. Steve Jobs often made people feel terrified. It's not intelligence. Intelligent people use evidence. Steve didn't need evidence. What Steve had was something rarer and more dangerous. He was not anchored to consensus reality the way other people are. He genuinely believed the world should bend to his vision, not the other way around. And for most of his life, it did. There's a story that Apple engineers tell. It surfaces again and again in memoirs, in interviews. in the testimonies of people who spent years in Steve's orbit. He would review a product, inspect it, turn it over in his hands, and then he would look up and say it wasn't good enough. Not the performance, not the specs, the feel of it, the weight, the curve of the edge, the exact shade of a color that most people would never consciously notice. He once delayed a product launch because the shade of beige on the outside of a computer wasn't right. He sent engineers back to redesign the internal circuit boards, boards that customers would never, ever see, because the layout wasn't beautiful. People around him learned not to argue, not because he was always right. Sometimes he was catastrophically wrong, but because the cost of disagreeing was so high. The emotional devastation of his disapproval could rearrange your entire sense of self. He had a binary vocabulary for the world around him. Things were either brilliant or shit. No middle ground, no nuance, no gradation. And here's where it gets psychologically interesting, because that kind of thinking, that inability to tolerate the imperfect, the mediocre, the good enough, that's not just a personality trait. That's a signal. Psychologists who study extreme perfectionism describe it the same way, as a defense mechanism, a wall, a way of saying, if everything around me is perfect, then maybe I am safe. Maybe I am enough. Maybe the story I told myself about being chosen is true. Steve Jobs could not tolerate imperfection in his products because on some level, he could not tolerate the possibility that he was imperfect. And what happens when a person like that builds the most successful technology company in the world? What happens when the external world actually confirms the internal narrative? In 1985, Apple's board of directors did something that shocked the industry. They pushed Steve Jobs out of his own company. The man who built Apple, the man who recruited John Sculley, the CEO who eventually led the charge against him, with a line that has since become legend. Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life? Or do you want to come with me and change the world? That man was voted out, stripped of his operational role, made irrelevant inside the company he had created. The official story is that he was difficult, erratic, a management disaster, and that was true. But the deeper story, the one that matters for understanding what Steve Jobs really was, is what happened after. Most people would have collapsed or rebuilt somewhere smaller, somewhere quieter. Steve Jobs did something different. He started Next, a new computer company, and Pixar, which at the time was just a small graphics division he bought from George Lucas. And then he waited, not patiently, not peacefully, but he waited. He spent 11 years in the wilderness, 11 years watching Apple slowly die without him. And in those 11 years, something inside him crystallized into something harder, something sharper, something more focused than anything he had been before. The question isn't what he did during those 11 years. The question is, what was happening inside him? Because when he came back to Apple in 1997, gaunt, focused, almost frightening in his clarity, he was not the same man who had left. He was something else, something that had been compressed under enormous pressure. and everyone who encountered him in those first months back could feel it. He walked back into Apple like it was his, because in his mind, it always had been. The company was weeks from bankruptcy, billions in losses, a product line so bloated and confused that even its own employees couldn't explain what it made or why. Steve sat down with his team and asked one question: what should we focus on? The team listed product after product, project after project, initiative after initiative. Steve listened, and then he drew a simple grid on a whiteboard. 4 boxes: consumer, professional, desktop, portable. 4 products. That's it. Kill everything else. The room went silent. They had been building dozens of products. They had engineers, partnerships, supply chains, stakeholders attached to all of it. He killed it all in an afternoon. That decision, that clarity, was terrifying to the people in the room. But here's the thing they missed. That clarity didn't come from genius. It came from the 11 years in the desert. It came from a man who had been expelled from the thing he loved most and had spent over a decade thinking about nothing else. He didn't build Apple 2.0 out of ambition. He built it out of obsession. And obsession, in the right circumstances, is more powerful than any strategy. Here's a question that none of the biographies answer satisfyingly. Why couldn't he stop? By 2001, after the iMac, after the return, after Apple's stock had climbed back from the edge, Steve Jobs had more money than he could ever spend. He had proven every person wrong who had ever doubted him. He had rewritten the story of his own exile into a triumph. He could have stepped back. He could have delegated, relaxed, enjoyed it. He didn't. He accelerated. The iPod, iTunes, the iPhone, the App Store, the iPad. Each one launched with the same ferocity, the same obsession, the same refusal to compromise. People around him described working with Steve Jobs the same way, decade after decade, electrifying, exhausting, sometimes wonderful, often brutal. He could walk into a room and make you feel like you were part of something historic. And then, 5 minutes later, look at your work and tell you it was garbage. He meant both things completely. There was no performance in either. And that's what's hard to reconcile, because a person who performs cruelty is one thing. You can understand that. You can protect yourself from it. But a person who genuinely sees the world in that violent binary, brilliant or worthless, world-changing or irrelevant, that's something you can't prepare for. Because they're not doing it to you. They're just seeing. And what does it mean to live inside a mind like that? What does it mean to go to bed every night with a vision so clear, so demanding, so absolute, that nothing in the waking world is ever quite good enough? In 2003, Steve Jobs received a diagnosis: pancreatic cancer. The doctors told him he had, at best, months to live. The tumor was there, visible, undeniable. He refused surgery for 9 months. 9 months. He tried acupuncture, herbal remedies, juice fasts, spiritual consultations. His friends begged him. His wife begged him. His doctors begged him. He refused. This is the part of the Steve Jobs story that people find most baffling. Here was a man of science, a man who had built devices that ran on the most advanced engineering humanity had produced. And he was rejecting medicine. How do you explain that? Some people say it was stubbornness. Some say he was in denial, but there's another interpretation. One that fits the psychological portrait we've been building. Steve Jobs spent his entire life believing that reality was negotiable, that if he simply refused to accept something, the universe would eventually comply. It had worked before. Engineers told him something was impossible. He refused to accept it. They found a way. The board tried to push him out permanently. He refused to accept it. He came back. The market said Apple was finished. He refused to accept it. He saved it. His entire life had taught him, had proven to him, that his version of reality was more powerful than everyone else's. And then he encountered something that didn't care about his reality distortion field. Something that his willpower and his vision and his certainty could not bend. By the time he agreed to surgery, 9 months had passed. The cancer had spread. He never fully recovered. The people who loved Steve Jobs, and there were people who genuinely loved him, often describe a contradiction they could never resolve. He was capable of extraordinary tenderness, moments of real connection, real humanity. He would sit with an engineer who was struggling and suddenly become the most encouraging person in the world. He would listen to music, really listen, with tears running down his face. He loved his children. He loved his wife, Laureen. He loved, in his way, the people who had been with him through the worst of it. And yet, he denied paternity of his first child, Lisa, for years, leaving her mother to survive on welfare while he was becoming one of the most powerful men in Silicon Valley. He parked in handicapped spaces. He screamed at assistants. He told colleagues their work was the worst thing I've ever seen in rooms full of people. He was, by almost every account, difficult in ways that caused real pain to real people. So how do you hold both of those things? The tenderness and the cruelty, the vision and the blindness, the man who changed the world and the man who couldn't look his own daughter in the eyes. The honest answer is, you don't resolve it. You sit with it. Because Steve Jobs was not a villain, and he was not a hero. He was something more uncomfortable than either. He was a person whose wound became his engine. And that engine built extraordinary things and left wreckage in its wake. In the final years of his life, people who saw Steve Jobs regularly noticed a change, not in his intensity. That never left, but in something underneath it. He seemed at moments to be asking a question he had never had to ask before. Not what should I build next, but something older, quieter, and far more difficult. Was it worth it? He began spending more time with his family, more time walking, just walking, which had always been his way of thinking. He reconnected with his daughter Lisa, imperfectly, incompletely, but genuinely. He gave a commencement speech at Stanford in 2005 that surprised everyone who thought they knew him. He talked about death. He said, Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life. This was not the Steve Jobs of product launches. This was not the man who had terrorized boardrooms and redesigned industries. This was a man who had looked at the thing that cannot be negotiated with, the thing his reality distortion field could not bend, and found something in the looking. Not peace exactly, but something. He died on October 5th, 2011. His last words, according to his sister, were spoken as he looked beyond his family to something only he could see. Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow. What he saw, what he felt in those final seconds, no one knows. But it fits, doesn't it? Even at the end, Steve Jobs was looking at something everyone else in the room couldn't see. Even at the very end, he was living inside his own reality. We talk about Steve Jobs the way we talk about forces of nature, like a storm that came through and rearranged everything and then moved on. But storms don't have wounds. Storms don't have abandoned children and reality distortion fields and 9 months of denial in the face of a diagnosis. Storms don't lie awake at night, driven by something they can't name. Steve Jobs did. And here's the thing that stays with you. After you've looked at the whole picture, the force that built Apple, the force that gave us the iPhone, that changed music and film and communication and design, it wasn't genius. It wasn't even vision. It was a boy who was given away before he could speak, who built a story around that wound to survive it, and who spent his entire life proving that story true. Every product, every launch, every impossible standard, every sleepless engineer, every moment of cruelty, every moment of brilliance, all of it was the same thing. A child pressing his face against the glass of the world, whispering, "I am chosen. I matter. I will not be given away again." The world heard him, whether he ever heard himself. That's the question that doesn't have an answer. And maybe that's the most human thing about him. Not the genius, not the cruelty, not the products. The question he was always asking, with every waking hour, with every impossible demand, with everything he built and rebuilt and refused to let be ordinary. The question he never stopped asking, am I enough?